But Matthew Berry just announced he's leaving ESPN after 15 years. And it's really it's something I've noticed over the last maybe year and a half or so. Even before I got to Odyssey and I left the network I was with before and was actually allowed to talk about sports betting here, which is amazing. Uh, I feel like we are getting now a shift, and we don't know where Matthew Berry is going yet, so we can only speculate, and I'm sure he'll announce it. And I'm a big fan of his. I think he does great work. He's a Commanders fan too, so he suffers like me, which is
Right.
great. Great guy. Talked to him a few times, had him on as a guest, all that. Nobody cares about that. The bigger thing here is that I feel a big seismic shift in our industry where fantasy is becoming fantasy sports, especially fantasy football, is kind of in the background now because everybody is gearing their attention towards betting specifically. And there's a lot of different reasons why for this, but just the overall umbrella of this whole situation just feels like everybody that's in fantasy sports is starting to realize, well, betting is where the highest amount of interest is, and then everything else is kind of like a bullet point after that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I guess I should just say also that, like, yeah, I used to follow Matthew Berry's content pretty closely. I mean, he started, what was it, Talented Mr. Roto was the site that he had before ESPN, and that
I
was,
think
so I mean,
that's, yeah.
15 years. I mean, I was, yeah, 15 years, the first year out of college, he was at ESPN basically. So that was, I mean, I wasn't betting at all basically at that point, or if I was, I was very insignificant and not a huge part of my life. But I was definitely playing fantasy football to a large degree. And probably I think I even played fantasy NBA for a couple. God help me, played fantasy
Yeah.
basketball for a couple of years. Fantasy baseball
Oh, I did
definitely had a
years.
league with my. Oh yeah, well
A
you
lot of
have to
work.
be a big fantasy
A lot of
NBA
work.
guy.
Yeah.
There's like no way you're not a big fantasy NBA guy.
I,
It's your
I'll be
wheelhouse
honest with
thing.
you though, DFS is a lot more fun because keeping up with the team
Sure.
all year long is anything other than football. Man, it takes a lot of work. I mean, I've won like 2 championships, I think, which is great. But there are times where I just lose interest in it, where I'm like, I'm exhausted. I can't do this anymore.
Humble brag. Yeah, it's like I think I won like
Yeah.
7 championships, and I was I was like a dynasty for
Oh,
a while, but I just
stop it.
so,
That's over like
but
15 years, man. Like, do you know how many bad teams I've had too? I've had plenty of them.
right. So I think there's like two things that are interesting. I think the most interesting thing is the one that you hit on, right? Which we can spend more of the segment going over, which is the idea, like, how much of, like, if you put fantasy and gambling all together, like how much on the pie chart is about to be one instead of the other? Are we like transitioning even more toward a larger part of the pie chart being betting and even less being fantasy? And like, what does that say too? Does it say that fantasy was kind of always a placeholder for betting because betting was a little
Mhm.
more taboo, accessible for sure, offshores and bookies? Like, it was not accessible, it was not inaccessible, but it was tougher to access. And fantasy was that almost like you know the placeholder, I guess, would be this, just to use the same word again, for like when gambling ended up becoming so mainstream and ended up taking the place. And if you have the two of them next to each other, are more people just going to choose betting? Because of course they will, right? There's like, it's like sort of more an immediate adrenaline rush. There's all kinds of benefits from a hobby standpoint, I guess, to betting versus fantasy. And there are benefits to fantasy as well, obviously. Cost less. It can be more like trash talk with your friends as opposed to playing in a market. But so I think the most important thing is what you hit on. But I just was kind of struck by, I was just thinking about this during the break. Like when when someone writes the comprehensive, unabridged history of like fantasy sports, that person will be a huge nerd. There's no question. But when that is written, when whoever writes that writes it, and it's like, hey, in the 1980s, people were playing, they were like faxing and using pagers to deliver like the reports to each other. My uncle, who lives in North Carolina, played fantasy baseball like in, like 1988 or whatever, with like entirely, it was all mailed. Like, you would mail stuff back to the owner, and then like he would mail you the results every week. I mean, just imagine like trying to run a fantasy league this way. That was the only thing that they had, so they did it.
Oh,
I mean, that's how long it's been around. And it's sort of like, you from this point, with not necessarily with Matthew Berry's announcement, but with that as one of the announcements or one of the things going on, you like look back at the last 30 to 40 years and you go, like, where are we in the history of fantasy sports right now? Is it possible, not that we're at the end? That's like that's an over dramatized way to put it. We're not at the end, and we're not going to be at the end for a long time, but just,
yeah.
are we definitely way on the downturn of it? Like, what was the peak? Like, when did it, now looking backwards, because we had fantasy sports was huge. In our break, people were saying like they used to read Matthew Berry's love hate column, which is like the most read column that he writes every year before the start of especially pro football season.
Yeah.
And as you would imagine, it's players that he loves and hates every single year, but it like was the primer to get you started thinking about fantasy football. People used to read that. They used to have the 24-hour fantasy marathon. I think Bill or Mike brought that up in our chat. Like, are they still going to have that marathon show? Matthew Berry had his own half-hour show. Fantasy Sports had a half-hour show on ESPN. It was on ESPN2, but it was still on the family of networks. The League was a really popular show that Matthew Berry made an appearance.
So
like fantasy, like fantasy football had its moment, right? And it feels like now we're pretty far removed from that moment. Now, fantasy became DFS, which is obviously a little bit different. Now it feels like DFS has become almost entirely betting, and everybody from that industry is trying to hop to this one, which again, you can squabble with whether that's a good move or not. That's not really about that, but just like, where are we in the history of fantasy sports? Like, is it about to be completely usurped and overshadowed even more by betting? Is this announcement with Matthew Berry leaving like another kind of notch on the timeline of when things really transition from one to the other, especially not to like read the tea leaves, but what is his most likely next move to be? Is it a sports book? Is it something that has to do with betting? I think that's very likely. So just, I think that's interesting. Just like, where are we in that history? When we look back at the history of this one thing, are we really close to the end of at least being very relevant and very mainstream? I was just thinking about that during the break.
I think what will keep fantasy sports, especially fantasy football, alive is, leagues that are competitive. Like, fewer people are going to sign up for random leagues where it's just like, I'm going to join a random league. They randomly put you in one and it's on ESPN.com or whatever the case is.
Mock drafting
leagues,
was a huge thing for a while.
The leagues that you've been in for a long time with friends or family or coworkers or whatever the case is, that will keep that stuff together. But it is trickling away, one, because you get a better return if you're betting and you bet on a game every week, or obviously games, and you win some, you lose some, whatever the case is, but you're going to have a final result every week. It's what made DFS so great for a while, where if you had a really bad draft, and we've all been there, you weren't stuck with that team the entire year, which makes a huge difference. Our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, where we just sit and stare at squirrels and then a bird and then go back to what we're doing. And then this is the world we live in. We have the attention span.
What was that Disney movie with the dog collar? That's what that's from, right? What was that from?
Yeah,
what was that movie?
I don't remember what it was, but I remember he said, my master gave me this collar so that I may
saying
speak.
It was up.
Squirrel.
Okay.
Yeah, up.
Right.
Squirrel, my master gave me this collar so that I may speak.
Man.
Squirrel. Yeah, that's right. My dog too. So that's exactly how it is. But that's the world we live in now. We all have short attention spans. I am absolutely one of those people. We do want instant results. We want instant resolutions to stuff. I like convenience. I like my food to be delivered to my house, my groceries to be delivered to my house. I love all that stuff. So if I can have an interest in a game, especially a financial interest, and as opposed to waiting to the entire season, and yeah, you may have money out on futures or whatever, but you can also just bet on a game. We have that option now. And in fantasy football, you may win a week, but any of that money, and we all know that everybody loves a little financial incentive on certain things, to be able to have that in sports betting versus having that and waiting till the end of the season in fantasy football, unless it's, some of these leagues, I've been in those where you get paid out every week for being the highest scoring team. That's cool, but it's just not the same. And we've now gotten to the point where this is something new and it's exciting for people, and it's no longer hidden in the back rooms of places somewhere. It's out in the open, and it's legal, and it's fun, and it's well run by great sports books that are there. And just like our friends at Bet Rivers, I got to say, they're doing a fantastic job.
I was waiting.
We love them very much. Very much.
I was waiting. Yeah.
But like, really, you know what I mean? Like, it's evolved now. We want instant gratification for things, and we're getting that with sports betting over fantasy sports in general. And like you said, you're talking about like fantasy baseball and basketball. Oh, exhausting to deal with that every week.
Yeah, and I think to your point where you're like, there's this immediacy, there's this adrenaline rush. Because I would tell like friends of mine this, or I was at a family reunion in Hilton Head, South Carolina a couple months ago at a wedding, and I had somebody in my family asked about this too. Like, they played fantasy, but they didn't bet a lot, and they were just kind of like asking me questions about it. And I just go, well, like, here's how I would, and they asked me if I still do fantasy now that and I go, no, basically. It's for several years I've done almost no fantasy sports. and I do one fantasy football league with former, well, I was going to say former friends from ESPN, but like they're still my friends. They're just, we don't all work at the same place anymore. Yeah,
Former
ex
colleagues that are
friends,
still
bunch of
friends. How about
losers.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I do this one league because it's the people are really fun and I like them, and the rules of the league are particularly crazy. So it's not even like a normal fantasy league. We don't even have to get into the particulars of it. That's the only thing I've done for like
All
3 or
right,
4 years.
you have to give me one. You got to give me at least one crazy rule. If you're going to say that, we got to hear something.
Sure. If your quarterback throws an interception, it's -2. That's conventional scoring. If the interception is returned for a touchdown, it's a -10.
Damn.
So on
That's
every
brutal.
interception that your quarterback throws, there's an immediate cold sweat that just like sinks in where you're like trying to
Yes.
line up the blocks and you're like, do I really? So there are some quarterbacks that are really not contributors to the team in terms of the scoring that they put up, whether it
Yeah.
was, I remember the Browns quarterback room when it was like Deshaun Kaiser and they went 1-15, the Hugh Jackson year, one of the two, part of the 1-31 run. I think they had like 9 interceptions for touchdown. I mean, it's really, there are some like all timers basically. And then you have kind of like the Jameis Winston Tampa season where it was like threw for a ton of yards, but also turned it over a lot. And just some of the negative points that come from that. So that one thing with it's called the -10, like just, and there'll be a chat going. And on Sundays when someone will have one to be like, oh, Patrick Mahomes -10, like whatever the play happens. So, but that's the only fantasy league I still play. I think, what I was, this conversation I was having a few weeks ago, I was basically like, yeah, here's why I don't play anymore. Cause there's a part of both fantasy and gambling that's about just the person involved wanting to be right. Like having an opinion about something and just wanting to be right. Like the money is a part of it too, but it's a big part of fantasy sports is obviously bragging rights with your friends. And a lot of that in football, especially, is basically tied to like, I think this guy is going to be awesome this year. And then when that guy is awesome, you're rewarded. Usually your team, if you pick whoever your RB1 is in fantasy football, if you pick the one of the group that ends up being awesome, there's like that, reward basically of like, I got it right. Like there were 7 running backs available. I picked the right one. And in fantasy football, especially versus other sports, like 1 or 2 of those picks versus other guys in that tier, basically, I mean, those are called league winners basically in a lot of circles. It's just like, that was literally the one pick that won you the league. Okay, well, what I said is, all right, well, that's great, but you could pick the league winner, and like in the semifinal, you lose by a point on some like you got it right, but you didn't win anything. And in betting, what I always try to say is like, if I think random player, if I think Saquon Barkley is going to be incredible this year, there are a lot of ways to express that opinion. Yeah, I can draft him in my fantasy leagues and have him on every team. That used to be when I was in college and you thought a guy would be good, be like, I have him on every team. Like that would be like the way that you like owned this prediction that you were trying to make, this piece of information that you thought you had that this guy was going to, well, I have him on all my teams. And it's like, well, okay, you could still lose you could literally not make the playoffs in every single league still. But if Saquon Barkley is awesome and I bet his yardage over, if he's awesome, I win. I win money on just by being right about the fact that he is awesome. And it's not that, it doesn't even matter. The sum is almost irrelevant. It's like there's a correlation 1-to-1 in like, I think this guy is going to be really good. Then when he is good, I win money. And it ain't fantasy sports. Like that's not what it is. So I do think that's interesting. I think a lot of people have kind of caught on to that content. And then week to week, obviously, like subbing guys in or out of the lineup. I think this guy's going to be good. This guy's not going to be good. Okay, well, just bet him in it as an anytime touchdown scorer. Bet him over his yardage prop that week. Like there are certain, again, 1-to-1 correlations in betting. And I think obviously the fantasy player has realized those. And it's not that they have to be like winning players, but it's just how they get their kicks, basically. Is it by doing a random fantasy league or is it by playing props on Sundays? So I'll be curious how far we go down this road of how much does gambling completely eat up like everything about fantasy. Fantasy will always be around. You play with your friends, like it'll be around. But just what does the pie chart look like a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road?
Well, I think, too, as more states legalize it, obviously, and then there's more outlets and resources for people that are curious about sports betting that then continue to get involved with it more and more and learn about it and get a couple of wins and maybe some free bets that help you get it. Like, it's going to be a learning process for a lot of people, but there's going to be more interest as time goes on. It's not going to be less because it's a growing industry and it's also becoming more and more prevalent around the country, which makes such a huge difference for everybody that wants to get involved with. The reality of it is everybody knows how to pick a bracket for March Madness. Anybody. Pam in accounting in your office can go ahead and pick a bracket, and she may know nothing about any of the teams, but people still like to be involved in that. But once you start having an understanding for sports betting, and maybe you haven't in the past, or you know something about sports, but interest will then generate a lot more, I guess, return on this industry in general with it. And I just think people in the end too, if there's money involved and you can get paid out every week for some games that you really like, that you won, that you bet on, I mean, there it is. That's going to be the difference
Yeah.
with it. So
And
yeah, it's
let's be honest,
fascinating where he
like
goes.
people, yeah, I mean, people in our chat were even saying like, I don't read them as much anymore. I don't do this as much anymore. What if it was betting? Like maybe that would change
Yeah.
people's minds.